In today's video, I want to review the Ozone Viper 6. The Ozone Viper 6 came to market a couple of months ago and is one of Ozone's high-performance paramotor gliders. This glider is very comparable to the well-known Ozone Viper XC, but has a few changes which we'll talk about in today's video. I received this wing in May, and the reason I have waited all the way until now, which is the end of September, early of October, to create this video is because I wanted to actually put time on the glider, fly the glider in a slew of different environments, do a variety of different flights, and truly get to know the glider before I give a quote-unquote review. Now, I want to make it known right off the bat that 1, Ozone is asking me to make this video, and they did send me the wing. But 2, I did purchase this glider with my own money and own this glider outright. I am inclined to make this video for Ozone, and Ozone, I apologize for taking so long to get to it, but as you heard earlier in this video, the purpose was to get true time on this glider before reviewing it. So there is a little bias. I also am a dealer for Ozone, sell Ozone, and is the wing brand I primarily sell. So please take all of that into consideration when you listen to my opinion about this glider. To give you a little backstory, I have put a lot of time on the Ozone Viper XC, which is a very comparable glider to the Ozone Viper 6. Since the release of the Viper XC, I have owned 2 different wings, a black and blue Ozone Viper XC 18 meter and a black and red Ozone Viper XC 20 meter. Now, up until only a few days ago, the Ozone Viper XC 20 meter was my primary glider and was black and red. However, there was one flight with the Viper 6 that ultimately led me to sell the Viper XC. So I want to start by first talking about the overall design of this wing. What is it made to be? What is it? What's comparable? And what exactly are you as a pilot looking for when you're looking at the Ozone Viper 6? The Ozone Viper 6 is a very comparable glider to the Ozone Viper XC, which is Ozone's high aspect ratio, cross-country focused, high performance, efficient glider on the marketplace. These wings are comparable to other wings like the Dudek Warp 2. These are a cross-country focused, flying long distances, flying smooth, flying efficiently, cutting through turbulence well gliders. These wings are designed for the pilots looking for an all-around glider whom go long distances, play near the LZ, and do a variety of different types of flying. The Ozone Viper XC and the Ozone Viper 6 are nearly identical. However, there are internal design changes, fabric changes, line changes that make them ever so slightly different. Personally, I feel like a more fair comparison or a more fair name for the Viper 6 is the Viper XC Lightweight Edition or Competition Edition. The Ozone Viper XC and Viper 6 biggest change between the two is the fabric used for the Viper 6 and the fabric used for the Viper XC. The Viper 6 has very lightweight fabric, which makes it easy to inflate, more maneuverable in flight, and really efficient when it comes to fuel burn. The Viper XC has a thicker, heavier material, which is going to last you longer, but you will notice a difference in the launching characteristics. One of the other notable changes between the Viper 6 and the Viper XC is the unsheathed lines of the Viper 6. The Viper XC has sheathed lines. Viper 6 has unsheathed lines. This subtle change is going to reduce the overall drag that you experience as you fly through the sky, which is going to make the Viper 6 ever so slightly more efficient. Now, talking a little bit about why I would pick one over the other and what kind of pilot would prefer one over the other, but I want to move on to the Ozone Viper 6 launching characteristics. Ozone in general is known for its effortless, easy, smooth launches. Their wings are known for being the nicest launching wings on the marketplace, and the Viper 6 is a perfect example of that. The lightweight fabric, the trimming, design, and overall build of the Viper 6 makes it effortless on those light wind, early morning inflations. I do notice a subtle difference between the Viper 6 and the Viper XC when it comes to inflations. The Viper 6 is very easy to inflate, and it very much so wants to stay above your head. It does not sag behind, it does not immediately fall out of the sky if you apply brakes. You are able to easily inflate the glider, apply heavy brakes, and not just spin or stall it out of the sky. Its launching characteristics definitely are easy in terms of inflation. The next thing that's very nice about it is that it doesn't shoot up like a rocket ship. Some wings are known and prone to shooting up very fast, in which overfly you easily if you're not going to grab a bunch of brake to stop it from overflying you. The Viper 6, from my experience, does not have this tendency. It does not want to just shoot up and overfly you, but it does want to drift to the sky and stay above your head. The next thing that's very nice about this Viper XC is the deep brake range on launch. You can apply heavy brake inputs without risking a stall or a spin like other gliders on the marketplace. You apply the brakes that you need to make for either a direction change or a correction, or even to assist you in lifting off the ground slightly sooner, and the glider will take it. Now, that doesn't mean that you want to take off hitting all of the brakes every single time. That's not what I'm getting at. But it has the ability to use heavy brake inputs without stalling or spinning, which is something about Ozone that I very much so enjoy on their launching characteristics. Some gliders, you go to launch and you really cannot touch any brakes until you've reached airspeed or even lifted off the ground, because there's just such a high risk of entering into a stall or a spin. They can't receive that much brake input that slow of speed. Now, as far as launching distance, takeoff speed, and lift produced, that's a very hard thing to measure. There's no real good way unless you stick a camera out in the morning and measure your launches over and over and over again, which I did not have the ability to do so here, but I would argue this is equally as easy, as smooth as a Viper XC, as comparable wings in that ecosystem. One of the things I do like about those Ozones and this Viper 6 is that I can give a little brakes to speed up my launching time, aka get off the ground sooner. Now, where this Viper 6 is going to shine most when it comes to launching is if you're launching in high altitude, light wind conditions. If you're known to be flying at higher altitudes, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000, 7,000, and you're known to be launching in very light and variable winds, the launching characteristics of this Viper 6 are very desirable. Having that easy inflation where it comes up, stays up, and you can give inputs without just stalling it out of the sky is extremely nice for those higher altitudes and or for those low wind switchy mornings. Moving on from its launching characteristics, let's talk about its landing characteristics. One of the things that I've always enjoyed about the Ozones, especially this Viper 6, is that you can get a really nice deep flare authority without the wing just stalling out of the sky. Sometimes you come in to land a glider, and as you give it the full flare, the glider enters into a stall and falls behind you. The Viper 6 is the most want to fly, quote unquote, glider I've ever flown. You land and it just will not come down. It's actually difficult to get the Viper 6 to come down, especially if you have a little bit of wind. So what that means is that you get a very deep brake range. You can land in a nice long swoop landing, use all of the flare authority, and it does not just come snapping out of the sky. As far as how slow, how soft the Viper 6 sets you down, I would say it's as comparable as anything else. I don't notice I'm going any faster. I don't notice I'm going any slower. I don't notice anything better or worse, which is probably a good thing. It lands nice, lands slow, lands soft, just like most other gliders. I very much so have enjoyed launching and landing the Viper 6, and by no means would I complain about it in the slightest. Now let's talk about the next thing, which is going to be the in-flight feel of the Viper 6. Viper 6 was very much so designed as a competition glider. Competition in terms of the European XC competitions where you're trying to fly from A to B and be as efficient as possible in the process. What that means is that the Viper 6 is a very efficient glider. The lighter the fabric, the ever so slightly more efficient. The less drag you experience, aka the thinner lines, the unsheathed lines, the slightly more efficient due to less drag. I can't say I notice any night and day change over anything else. I didn't get on this glider and all of a sudden was twice as efficient. But if we're gonna split hairs and discuss the ever so slight changes, it was ever so slightly more efficient than the comparable Viper XC. Now, nothing, again, to really write home about, but it was there. There was an ever so slight bump in efficiency due to the reduced drag, the redesigned profile, the lightweight fabric. All of those things in combination did make it ever so slightly more efficient. As far as maneuverability went in the sky, there's kind of two things. The first thing is going to be the ease of the maneuverability, aka how roll happy is the glider. And the second thing is going to be how it carries itself through energy. Is it divey? Does it carry energy? Does it burn energy? Does it lift well? We'll talk first about its roll rate. The roll rate of the Viper 6 is better than the roll rate of a comparable Viper XC. That lightweight fabric also is going to make it ever so slightly more maneuverable in the sky, just like a lightweight motorcycle or a lighter car is going to be ever so slightly more maneuverable. This lightweight fabric is going to give it a little more of a snap to its roll. It rolls ever so slightly faster than a Viper XC does. So when you go to give it the input, you're going to get more of a roll effect than you will on a Viper XC for a comparable amount of input. Meaning, it is a snappy, fun, roll-happy wing. But by no means is it as snappy, fun, and rolly as the previous Viper 5 or as the Freeride 2. The winglets that are on the Viper 6 do dampen the roll effect. You do receive less roll because of those winglets, but you do get added stability, which we'll talk about in a second. The previous Viper 5 was a extremely roll-happy glider. You'd give it any input and you were already upside down. That was more comparable to something like a Carve 2, a Freeride 2. The Viper 6 does not have that level of insane roll rate like the Viper 5 did, but it does have a very nice, snappy roll rate. Not quite comparable to a Freeride 2, Viper 5, Carve 2, AWOC 3, Snake 4, but it is there, and it is ever so slightly better than the comparable Viper XC. The next thing to talk about is how it carries energy. The Viper lineup has always carried energy very well. The high aspect ratio, very efficient profile is known for lifting and carrying that energy very well in wingovers. You could do very high, very floaty, very boaty, very nice wingovers anytime you would like to. It carries that energy well. It's also not super ground happy. Some gliders, as you go to do maneuvers, you eat up all of the altitude. Something like a Freeride 2, where no matter how high you are, you're already down to the ground on a couple of wingovers. It just eats altitude. The Viper lineup is not at all like that. That includes the Viper XC and the Viper 6. The Viper 6 is very much so big, floaty. And by big and floaty, I just simply mean it carries energy beautifully. It carries it, keeps it, holds it, and gives it to you to use. Some gliders are more prone to soak up that energy as you start to build it and not give all of it to you. It's as if it's taking 20% off the top just in the dive, and it doesn't give you all of the energy to play with. The Viper lineup, and the Viper 6 in specific, is not at all that way. It gives you all of the energy, which, for better or for worse, I personally love that. I'm not the kind of pilot that enjoys a really fast roll rate. I'm not the kind of pilot that enjoys a really divey glider. I like the big, boaty, floaty, energetic, playful wings like the Viper lineup, which is why the Viper XC was my previous main wing, and now the Viper 6 is my current main wing. And I love that. Every wing is slightly different when it comes to how it carries that energy. Something like a Dudek Warp 2 does not carry energy and have that same pop to it that a Viper 6 does. The Vipers are known for not being ground hungry, and they're known for carrying that energy, holding on to it, and delivering it to you when you want it to use. The next thing we'll talk about is the winglets. I'm sure you've seen those little pointy winglets on the edges of the two wingtips. The design behind that and the goal behind those is to reduce the oscillation that you experience as you're flying. It's more of a cross-country focused thing. As you're flying from point A to point B, you can release the brakes and the glider is not going to rock back and forth as you're flying. Something like the Viper 5, which was the previous model of the Viper lineup, was very prone to oscillating. It was a roll-happy glider, and the downside of that very roll-happy was that it was prone to oscillating and rolling back and forth as you weren't trying to roll back and forth. The Viper 6 winglets definitely dampen the oscillation effect felt. You can release the brakes, fly straight and level, on throttle, off throttle. Assuming you're correcting for the torque steer and torque compensation, it will just track nicely. It doesn't just rock around. If you experience a little bit of turbulence, it grabs hold of that oscillation nicely, corrects, and starts flying straight again, and you're not really fighting the oscillation like you are on some other gliders. Something like the Freeride 2, which is very prone to rocking back and forth. If you experience a little bit of turbulence, it's going to start rocking you, and now you need to step in to correct it, whereas something like the Viper 6, Viper XC, is going to correct that for you. So if you're flying through turbulence, if you're flying in a straight line, if you're trying to cover distance, those winglets are very nice. Now they do dampen the roll effect that you experience. So if you're looking for purely a roll-happy glider, these winglets do dampen that roll ever so slightly. I don't have a number off the top of my head as to how much of that roll is reduced or dampened because of those winglets, but it is there. The Viper 5 and the Viper 6 roll very differently. Now the next thing that I want to talk about is the in-flight turbulence feeling. Now, similar to an airplane, the lighter the airplane, the more it's going to experience the wind, the turbulence, the moving around effect. You fly something like a Airbus A380 or a Boeing 747 through some turbulence, and it's not going to notice or care. You fly a Cessna 152 through some turbulence, and you're very much so going to notice. The heavier the aircraft, the more dampening of the turbulence you're going to experience. Well, the Viper XC being a heavier fabric and the Viper 6 being a lightweight fabric mean that the two experience and feel turbulence differently. The Viper XC is more prone to soaking up and dampening that turbulence effect felt, and so you don't feel it nearly as much. Whereas the Viper 6 as a lightweight fabric glider is going to dance around ever so slightly more. You're going to feel it more than you do on a comparable heavier weight fabric glider, which kind of goes both ways. Firstly, as you're flying through turbulence, you're definitely going to notice the turbulence more. The smaller the turbulence, the more you will notice than the comparable gliders. But the Viper 6 does experience the turbulence ever so slightly more than something like a Viper XC. The benefit of that, and one of the things that a lot of paraglider pilots in specific tend to pursue, is that the lighter weight fabrics talk to you better, tell you what's going on, and give you the ability to make the inputs sooner and more accurately than something that is heavier and dampens the feeling. So what I mean by that is if you're flying through turbulence, that Viper 6 is very good at telling you what's going on so you can make the inputs you need to correct for any surges or oscillation or a potential collapse or anything of that manner. Whereas something that is a heavier weight fabric is going to dampen further and not talk to you until a later date. Essentially what I mean by that is that Viper 6 is going to talk to you, say, 20% sooner and tell you what's going on sooner than a comparable Viper XC and something like a Dudek Warp, which is even heavier weight fabric and dampens even more. As a paraglider pilot myself, who regularly goes thermaling on 3-hour cross-country flights, and I love flying thermic conditions, I love flying paragliders, I love all of that stuff. I personally enjoy receiving the inputs because as I receive the information, I know how to respond, correct, and give proper responses much sooner than something that is heavy and dampens that information until later when it may be too late. I used to fly a Dudek Warp 2, and by no means is this to criticize on the glider. I loved that glider, and this video is not about that glider. But that glider in specific dampens a lot of the turbulence effect felt, which can be both a good and a bad thing. I personally did not like that feeling because it felt to me as if I wasn't receiving any of the information until it was almost too late. So you had a very short time to respond to the information that it gave you. Whereas something like a Viper 6, as soon as something begins to happen, you receive that information and can make the corrections necessary. That is just a subtle difference and a personal preference. The Dudek Warp 2 and the Viper XC, which is a heavier weight fabric, is more known to dampen that level of turbulence, and I have gone through a lot of turbulence on a Viper XC. I went through a lot of turbulence on a Viper 5. Overall, the Viper 6 is a comfortable experience in turbulence if you're comfortable receiving information. If you're not a pilot who likes the feedback, it may not be the most comfortable wing for you, and you may feel as if it's very talkative, because it is. It's a talkative glider in turbulence, which is something paraglider pilots tend to prefer as they can receive that information and respond accordingly. I personally like that, but there are times as I'm flying through, say, super mild turbulence, where I'm not that interested in receiving all of the feedback, and that is one of the downsides of that lighter weight fabric. Everything in aviation, including fabric, lines, everything, is a trade-off. You get, but you give. Lighter weight fabric means you're ever so slightly more efficient, easier launches, but you experience and feel that turbulence ever so slightly more. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is the longevity of this glider. The lighter weight fabric is going to last less long. It's going to wear out sooner than the comparable heavier weight fabric. This is simply a trade-off. You are receiving the lightest fabric you can get, and as a result, you get the easy inflations, the slightly more efficient, slightly more roll rate. The downside is it's not going to last as long. Now, I don't have any numbers. I don't have any data because the glider hasn't been out long enough to truly speak on this, but I would argue that the Viper 6 is not going to last as long as a Viper XC. The Viper XC does have that heavier fabric material and is going to last longer than something like a Viper 6. It is a trade-off, and it is a question of how you treat the glider and how you use the glider that will really make a big difference. I personally have chosen the trade-off of the lightweight fabric. I personally have chosen the Viper 6 over something like the Viper XC, which we're going to talk about here in just a second. Longevity. I have no idea how long you can expect a Viper 6 to last, but if I was going to take a guess, I would put a number somewhere around 200 hours. If you were going to ask me how long something like a Viper XC would last, I'd put that number closer to 300, maybe 400 hours, probably closer to 300. So you are going to receive more flight time out of a Viper XC than you will out of the Viper 6. But again, trade-offs. That's all everything is in aviation. And that is why I feel like the Viper 6 should have been labeled as a Viper XC lightweight edition. It is simply a Viper XC, but a more competition style, a lighter weight version that has a little bit more in the performance of the Viper XC, but you definitely don't get as long out of that glider. In the paragliding world, they tend to make two wings. They make the heavy fabric version and the lightweight fabric version, just like Ozone does with the Spider and Sirocco 3. Having the lightweight version gives pilots the option. There is definitely a slew of pilots out there who are going to find themselves preferring the Viper 6 over something like the Viper XC, myself included. It is going to be a more desirable glider for the higher altitude, light wind launches, extreme cross-country focused, want more roll rate kind of guys. So now let's talk about why I ultimately chose the Viper 6 over the Viper XC, despite having owned two Viper XCs. I just sold my Viper XC a couple of days ago, and in fact, the day I'm filming this, I go to ship it to the new owner. I kept the Viper 6. And the reason I kept that Viper 6 is because, first off, I live at high altitudes. I'm at 5,000 feet even. And on a warm morning, we'll have density altitude all the way up to 8,000 feet. I definitely notice the density altitude. I definitely notice the altitude in general, the elevation, and I like having the lightest weight fabric possible. The reason I like that is for the easy inflations. Not only do I launch here at 5,000 feet, but I'll land at the top of the mountains at 9,000 feet with density altitude being well beyond that. Now I really notice that lightweight fabric. I live in an environment which is perfect for having the lightweight fabric, and I really desire that lightweight fabric as I do notice the launching characteristic differences. The other thing I really liked about that Viper 6 was the roll rate. It was everything the Viper XC was in terms of efficiency, stability, feeling, launch, all that stuff. But I got more roll out of it. And it's not that the Viper XC didn't roll. It did. It rolled totally fine. It's that I got ever so slightly more. And if we're going to split hairs, or we're going to discuss the very fine-tuned differences between performance, you do get more roll rate out of a Viper 6. And I liked that. And so I ended up hanging on to that Viper 6 as it's giving me everything the Viper XC was giving me, but a little easier launches and more roll rate and ever so slight increase in efficiency, which, to be completely honest, I don't really notice because I tend not to push the envelope of efficiency. All right, guys, with all of that being said, that is my review of the Viper 6 and my thoughts on that Viper 6. Overall, I think it's a great glider, and that's why I own one. I think the Viper 6 should have been labeled the Viper XC Competition or the Viper XC Lightweight Edition. I think that would have made more sense in the marketplace as to what this glider was, as there was a lot of question marks. What is it? Why would I get it over the Viper XC? I hope this video helps answer some of those questions. I love this glider. I love the Ozone lineup in general. I love their philosophy when it comes to glider design, and that's why I end up flying Ozones in general. With all of that being said, thank you guys for watching. I will be making a Kona 3 and a Moxie Power review very soon, so keep an eye out for those. My name is Trevor Steele. I will see you next time. Take it easy.